Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about the X-Men, Apocalypse, and his four horsemen. Before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. Prologue to today's story is a very brief recap of a couple of recent adventures. One is that when Cobra moved the pyramids, we saw that Wakanda had expanded its borders, and Black Panther's family now rules the entire continent of Africa, which, of course, includes Egypt. In a separate adventure, we saw Xenoscope's version of Jasmine from the original Aladdin stories, and she was a genie who had been enslaved by men. So now she got her hands on this artifact similar to the Infinity Gauntlet called the Crown of Kings, and she was conquering men. So, point being, there are multiple empires on Earth K, and they are all butting heads. When Jasmine's empire collides with the empire in Africa, there are border wars. The same thing is happening with the new Mongolian empire ran by Khan. And we also established that on Earth K, the USSR never really died out, unlike on Earth 1 from DC Comics or Earth 616 from Marvel Comics. On Earth K, the USSR still exists. It's just not a communist country anymore. And we kind of glossed over it, but Black Widow, aka Natasha Romanova, was the daughter of Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanova. So Black Widow is actually the rightful heir to the Russian throne in our game world. So we made her the Tsarina. But I digress. The point is that the new Mongolian Empire is having border wars with our version of the USSR, as well as Jasmine's new Persian Empire. And Jasmine's empire also has to fight the Wakandans. So in this game session, we bring in Apocalypse and his four horsemen, and specifically the horseman called War. He is in this region, and we gave him the same power that we gave Ares, which is broadcast empath, specifically the ability to make those around him feel more violent and less likely to find a peaceful or diplomatic solution to things. We also hinted that he might be influencing the leaders of these countries and that he is behind all of this recent conquest. Which brings us to the main plot. The total number of lives lost is getting close to the total number of lives that were lost during the entirety of World War II. So the X-Men's Blackbird flies overseas and lands where Apocalypse and the Four Horsemen are at. And by the way, we said that what war had done, death, famine, and pestilence had also done in terms of the sheer casualty number, right? And they were doing this with wildfires and plagues and even attacks from wild animals, thanks to the animal control power. So when the X-Men get there, we roll initiative, and Apocalypse is attacked by the following characters: Colossus, Cyclops, Forge, and Rogue. And according to the Marvel Superheroes RPG by TSR, and by the way, I feel like this is the sort of thing that someone's going to say in the comment section, I don't like your stats for Apocalypse, or I don't like your stats for the Four Horsemen. Um, that's always been an issue in our games. Different people, they read a comic and they have different ideas about where they think the characters should be at. One person will think a character should be stronger. The next person thinks you should lower that strength. You know what I mean? And so the way that we found over the years to keep the peace is to just say, look, this is not Earth 616, right? This is Earth K. We made it its own dimension partially because of these sorts of arguments that can pop up. Um, but we say, on some Earths, Apocalypse might look like this, and on another Earth, he might look like that. Things vary, right? So our version, for better or worse, just uses the published stats from the official Marvel role-playing game. And we've been playing our game since 1985. So in 1985, the official Marvel game at that time was the one that TSR made. So yes, there's a lot of times when people don't like those stats, just chalk it up to this being an alternate universe. You know what I mean? Because otherwise there's just no end of people fighting over what they think the numbers should be. And I get it. I'm right there with you. Like, I'm a big fan of Rogue. Personally, I would like to see her have more strength than they give her, but it is what it is. Um, and we could have that discussion another time too. This is also worth saying. Back in the day, Stan Lee was not a fan of the way DC Comics told stories. And one of the things that Stan always said was he thought characters like Superman, and this would be, by the way, back in the pre-crisis era, right? Where like one time we saw Superboy with like a chain over his shoulder, and he's literally dragging a bunch of planets like it's a necklace of beads or something, right? Just mega scale. He's dragging all these planets behind him, and he says something like, good thing I'm evacuating this galaxy. So Stanley hated that. He thought that the characters were harder to relate to. It was harder to kind of wrap your head around that scale, right? So Stan's approach was to make characters that do stuff like they're strong enough that they can pick up a car or they can throw a tank, but that's about it. You know what I mean? And so I always thought that with the DC characters, they start off with kind of like mythology. They start off with like the Greek gods like Atlas and stuff like that. And then they kind of bring it down a notch. I always felt like the Marvel philosophy was to start with a regular person and then take him up a notch. So characters like Cyclops, for instance, he's almost a normal guy, but he's got this optic blast. So I've always thought that that's a big thing, and I feel like we've lost sight of that over the years, especially younger guys who only started reading comics in the last 10 years or something like that. It's gotten to where I feel like Marvel and DC sort of eventually, because back in the day you used to have more of a thing of like this guy would only work for this company, that guy would only work for that company. The two seemed more separate. I feel like now with the writers and artists and stuff, a guy will work for one company and then he goes to the other and they kind of ping pong back and forth. Things start to have more of like a sameness than I think they used to have. You know what I mean? And so that's another thing to keep in mind with all of this, that um when they made the old TSR Marvel game, I feel like it reflected a lot of those classic Marvel ideas and the classic Marvel philosophy that bigger is not necessarily better, right? And so I do think you see a lot of characters like Daredevil and the Punisher and stuff that are fan favorites, um, but they're not dragging a chain of planets behind them. You know what I mean? I just wanted to get that out there because we were very surprised by the stats they gave Apocalypse and his four horsemen, and you're going to see that here in a minute. So the point is, Apocalypse has unearthly endurance. And so when we convert that into DC the way we do it, that ends up being a body of 12. And so the X-Men were able to dogpile Apocalypse and knock him out. He was not this, like anti-monitor level, entity. He's not Galactus or whatever. He was defeatable and they defeated him. Next up was Death. He was attacked by Angel, Banshee, Gambit, and Psylocke. And again, according to TSR, his endurance was remarkable. Again, that's very doable. So the X-Men fought him and won. Famine, was attacked by Beast, Shadowcat, Storm, and Sunfire. And Famine only had typical endurance. And I think the idea there is he's like starving and sickly, and you know what I mean? So Storm was easily able to take the win. And by the way, it's worth noting that this Storm, our current version of Storm on Earth K, is the daughter of Queen Chimera of Wakanda, who in turn was the daughter of the original Storm, right, from classic Marvel Comics, and her husband, who was Black Panther, right? So all of this death and destruction and all this stuff that's going on in this part of the world, this is very personal to our version of Storm. Anyway, so getting back to the the fights, Pestilence is attacked by Iceman, Longshot, Nightcrawler, and Polaris. And TSR gave Pestilence a remarkable endurance. So again, it was actually not that hard for the X-Men to win. And last but not least, there is War, who was attacked by Dazzler, Havoc, Jean Grey, and Thunderbird. And War actually had an endurance that was poor, which again surprised us. But a few blasts from Dazzler and Phoenix, won. They knocked the villain out. So the fighting didn't last as long as I had hoped. Um, and I don't know if that was um, that maybe Apocalypse in his first appearance was not really like he is now. You know what I mean? Or if maybe they were in a rush or something when they came up with the stats for it. Like I said before, for better or worse, though, we said these were the stats, right? Um, at any rate, whatever the case may be, this was a pretty easy win for the X-Men. And then they talked about, but what do we do with the villains? So Storm called her mom, who again is Queen Chimera. And then Wakanda sent some ridiculously high-tech air vehicles to pick up the villains. And Queen Chimera comes along and she greets the X-Men with open arms. Because her mom was a member of the X-Men, she was a member of the X-Men, and now her daughter is one of them. And so the X-Men are taken back to the Queen's home where they are treated as honored guests. So this part of the game was cool. The players sort of did some sightseeing, and I ran Wakanda more like we see in the MCU, where it's like very high tech, while still keeping a lot of nature everywhere. But because the horsemen were being a problem, the trees here are diseased, and the grass is dying, and the people and the animals are very sick, etc. So we had the X-Men call back to the Xavier School of Gifted Youngsters, where Powerhouse is teaching the New Mutants class. And they are currently in the danger room when Cyclops calls Powerhouse. And Cyclops asks if Powerhouse's friend is still staying at the school. And he's referring to Bioman, aka Dave Eckelberger, whose mutant power is life form control from TSR's old Ultimate Powers book. Life form control, by the way, for those who are unfamiliar, and I suspect that'll be the majority of listeners, it consists of the following superpowers: biophysical control, biovampirism, body transformation others, emotion control, exorcism, force field versus hostiles, forced reincarnation, grafting, hypnotic control, mind control, mind transferal, neural manipulation, plague carrier, plant control, plant growth, sense alteration, shape change others, sleep induced, spirit storage, summoning, and even undead control. And then on top of all that, Bioman has a symbiote akin to Venom. But instead of spider powers, this symbiote is psionic in nature, more like Jean Grey. And it has powers like telekinesis and telepathy. And when he's wearing the suit, he looks a bit like a cross between two old anime characters, one being the Guyver and the other being Ultraman. So when he's wearing the Inner Demon symbiote, Bioman is covered in a gray carapace. He has an oversized, um, almond shaped eyes, sort of like an alien gray, but his are bright yellow. And he has no real mouth that you can see. And then he also has olive drab trim at his joints, like behind his knees and in the armpit area and stuff like that. Anyway, so Queen Chimera invites Dave to Wakanda, and he uses his life form control powers to cure diseases and heal the blind and, fix what's wrong with the trees and bring back the green grass and, all that jazz. And this is a throwback, by the way, to several different games that we ran 20 years ago. Also, along similar lines, for those who've been following the channel all along, or to newer listeners who've gone back and listened to the older adventures, something that you may recall is that John Redbridge was in the Deep South in the 1970s, sort of back in the Smokey and the Bandit era. And during that time, he met Rogue at Book's Bar, where she was a waitress at the time. And they conceived a child named Matrix, who is basically a male version of Rogue. And Matrix was a major character in our game back in the 90s. But by having Matrix exist and by marrying Rogue off to John Redbridge, that meant that on Earth K, Gambit and Rogue never dated, which really annoyed some of our players. So all these years later, in this adventure, we finally have um, a Rogue who is the daughter of the original Rogue and John Redbridge. And then we also have the new Gambit, who is the son of the original Gambit and a woman named Belladonna. And as is almost always the case on Earth K, because of the Scarlet Witch's probability control powers, the new Gambit is the spitting image of his father. He has the same powers as his father, etc. So after all these years, we finally got to see a Gambit hit on a Rogue and get slapped. Gambit is a player, just like his father was. That, by the way, is another thing that some of our gamers complain about. But we ran the Gambit of Earth K as someone who doesn't care if a woman is married or not. And we based that idea on an old issue that Jim Lee did where the X-Men broke up into two teams. One team had to defend the mansion while the other team had to force their way in. And aside from this being a training exercise, if there were any security breaches, then that would also let Professor X know what they needed to fix so that when real villains showed up, the X-Men would be ready for them. Anyway, so Jean Grey was married to Cyclops at the time, and Gambit broke in and then kissed her against her will. Jean was trying to push him off of her, and he just forced himself on her that much more. Then she exploded, literally. And we found out that it wasn't the real Jean, it was an android look-alike. But that doesn't really matter, right? Because the point is that Gambit doesn't care if you're married. He will still happily force himself on your wife if he feels like it. So that is always how we ran Gambit in our game world. So he tries that crap with Rogue and she shoots him down, right? And he says, don't hate the game, Cher. Hate the. And then the player realized he was accidentally saying that phrase backwards, but before he could backpedal, everyone was laughing at him, which is probably like everybody's favorite part of the adventure. The other thing we had going on was that the mutants were treated really well in Wakanda. And so then some of the X-Men just wanted to live here and be respected and etc., right? So we paraphrased the late Martin Luther King Jr. and said that Wakanda was a nation where the X-Men are not judged by the fact they are mutants, but by the content of their character. And it was Storm who spoke up and said, she grew up here. And of course, since she is royalty, she is treated way better here than she is in the United States. But she doesn't live in New York to be treated well. She lives in New York to teach others to treat each other well. And that sort of then kills the argument that the X-Men should take the selfish way out and focus on their own wants rather than helping those around them and being selfless. Then we got into the epilogue, which was actually set on the moon, which in our game world is actually not the moon. Recently, an Autobot named Starsaber got into a fight with a Decepticon named Dezaris. During the battle, a stray blast struck what we think of as the moon, and the explosion kicked up millions of years worth of dust and soil, revealing that what lies under the surface is actually this huge metallic sphere. And this is the Planet Buster. It was created millions of years ago by an alien race known as the Vought. And on one side of it, it has what you might think of as the main gun from the Death Star. So now the whole world knows that that's no moon, it's a space station, right? So Megatron and Galvatron fly here. And this is another thing I probably need to explain. Back in the day, we ran our version of an old time travel story from the Transformers comics. In it, Megatron in the 1980s is visited by his future self, who now goes by the name Galvatron. The two of them fought because they both want to be the sole leader of the Decepticons, and neither have the mindset that they are willing to be second in command to anyone, not even themselves. Anyways, sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. And right now, they are working together. And the thing they want to do is use the Planet Buster on Earth. But as is so often the case, that's a story for another day. So we enjoyed this one. We hope that you liked hearing about it. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.